Over 2,000 players were dropped into a huge 5,000 by 5,000 custom Minecraft world where they would join one of 3 civilizations, each with their own special custom coded abilities and perks designed to actually simulate what a real civilization would be like. Over the course of about a week, they would work together to create guilds and factions, conquer and destroy other civilizations' bases, fight special custom bosses to get powerful weapons, participate in server-wide events to control the economy, or to ultimately see what civilization would come out on top and be declared the winner. This is the first real civilization event where there's no script, no application process, anybody can join, and these civilizations actually do something hard-coded into the game. The first true Minecraft civilization. And best of all, you can join and play it right now. Everything you're about to see is available to play as a game mode on my Minecraft server, exactly 1-to-1, but more on that later. Let's begin. Day 1, the server opened and immediately players rushed in. Some congregated around the spawn coliseum, the only neutral non-combat zone on the server, carefully contemplating which of the 3 civilizations to join, whilst others picked the first that caught their eye, eager to stake their claim on the custom map and establish themselves before their enemies could. Unlike almost all other civilization events you would have seen on YouTube, which are restricted to only a certain number of players, often through an application process, there was no whitelist for this event. Anybody could join and play at any time over the entire week the event would run. I would not be interfering at all in the event either, meaning this is as natural behavior as you can get. I wanted to see how the players would truly act if they were part of a civilization, an actual simulation. The first day was pretty calm. Most players split into small groups with other members of their civilizations known as guilds, or as we will call them, factions, and begun exploring the map. This is the faction named War Guild. They are part of the Windrunners civilization, and as such have begun building in a mountainous jungle biome. Which, speaking of, around the huge custom map were a variety of unique biomes which made up each of the 3 civilizations' native territories. Luscious, tropical and green biomes like jungles, forests and wilds were part of the civilization known as the Windrunners, represented by green. Cold, snowy and mountainous biomes like taigras, hills and alpines were part of the civilization known as the Frost Walkers, represented by light blue. And flat, dry and expansive biomes like deserts, plains and mesas were part of the civilization known as the Plains Walkers, represented by orange. The map was evenly divided so that the 3 civilizations had the same amount of territory made up of their native biomes. The players were able to view where their civilization's biomes were on an in-game map. Here are 2 players of the Ligma faction, very mature, part of the Frost Walkers, exploring a huge open custom cave that borders a cold, snowy redwood tundra biome. Whenever players were in their civilization's native biomes, which is their territory, they would receive a variety of buffs. So for example, these War Guild players, whilst in their territory, received Speed 1, Haste 1, Night Vision, faster Elytra speed, slower hunger decrease speed, and much more, as you can see on the screen here. These were the general buffs all civilizations got when in their own native biomes. Whilst many players split into small groups, not all decided to work together. Some, fearful of betrayal, decided to explore the world alone and become stronger first, pillaging some of the various custom structures around the world for their resources, before teaming up with others. Whether or not this decision was a mistake, only time would tell. Some solo players were already fighting over resources and perishing in the process. Here, an uneasy alliance formed between 2 members of the Planeswalker civilization who were caught far out of their civilization's flat, dry territory, deep in Windrunner land. I should also add that while all of these civilizations get those cool perks and buffs when in their civilization's land, they also get some special civilization-only perks, or as I called them, civilization attributes. For example, when Planeswalkers were in their land, they got lava and fire resistance, and faster horse movement speed. When Frostwalkers were in their land, they got reduced fall damage, speed 2 when it was snowing, and poison resistance. And when the Windrunners were in their land, they got permanent respiration, speed 2 when it was raining, as well as permanent depth strider. The reason these perks and attributes were added was to simulate what it would truly be like to have a home ground advantage when in your native land. Members of civilizations who live in these biomes would become accustomed to them, and thus would survive and navigate them more efficiently, which is what all the perks and attributes are meant to represent. Certain crops would also grow faster depending on the civilization as well, to represent represent how they would each have their own unique food sources and methods of farming. Anyways though, the players were moving quick, and the ones that worked together already had themselves full sets of diamond armor and tools. Some had spent the past few hours walking to the world border and setting up bases there, whilst others had taken to combat. Interestingly, this is where the first cross-civilization alliances formed. Near spawn at the ruins of a castle, a rather stacked Planeswalker member got into combat and slew a Windrunner, but was forced to retreat as Windrunners and Frostwalkers teamed up to take him on. It didn't work out for the dynamic duo though, and this player stood alone as other players terrified watched from afar, trying to bow him to death. He got too cocky and was eventually slain by the Windrunners, who showed that teamwork would in fact be paramount to civilization's success. Here is this really cool base owned by a Frostwalker faction known as Dragon's Keep. While it looked epic, it wasn't that well protected though. Later in day 1, a member of the Windrunner faction war guild did some testing and discovered that the very corner of the base was unclaimed, and using this he was able to dig down and enter the base. Hilariously, this wasn't the first time he had broken in that day, as this sign in the base suggested, as well as this video. Although he didn't actually break anything, he sort of just entered the base to prove he could, took a look around admiring the farms and architecture, then went on his merry way. As the day drew to its close and players underwent work on their bases, a few even placed down their end crystal core. To explain, the winner of the civilization event would be determined by the civilization who collectively raided and conquered the most other civilizations' bases. And the way we would keep track of that was by the number of cores each civilization destroyed in total, as well as some special events which will happen later. The core was therefore an extremely valuable part of the base that had to be protected and hidden. By day 2, the 3 civilizations had roughly 200 members each, and each civilization had roughly 30 to 40 factions part of them. Day 2 is where the stronger, more organized factions would begin to emerge as well. This is the Frostwalker faction named FFFFF, who decided to build a hidden base underground in an old school faction style. Their goal was to instead hide in their enemy's territory where they would least expect it. Check out this Planeswalker faction known as Spirit, who had an underground, sea level, and sky base all in one. Very creative. A few factions also probably should have tried to hide their bases a bit better, as these Frostwalkers kinda just waltzed into this Windrunner's base and looted all their chests. That being said, most factions made the smart decision to make use of their civilization's territory and had begun building bases and farms in their biomes. This Windrunner, for example, realizing that cocoa beans grew much faster in Windrunner territory, decided to make this huge cocoa bean farm, an interesting money-making strategy. In fact, he even decided to make a faction named the Bean Wall too. Other Windrunners were taking a more traditional approach out in the vast openness of their civilization's native territory, whilst some players made hidden bases mere blocks below the surface, covered in obsidian, to prevent TNT cannoning, as we'll later see, or creatively hidden in the custom terrain barely out of sight. Other players had an insatiable bloodlust and decided, instead of building a base, to go fight around spawn, now that they finally had got geared. And this is where the power of teamwork would become evident. The FFFFF faction decided to 4v1 a lone planeswalker caught out near the dungeon at spawn, and it seemed he would have no escape, but then a clutch enderpearl gave him a few seconds to accept the teleport requests of a few planeswalker allies, and suddenly the fight had completely turned around. The 3 planeswalkers decimated the Frostwalkers, despite them calling in allies of their own. It was an absolute slaughter. Now, if you paid keen attention to that fight, you may notice the planeswalker members seemed to be super tanky, able to take many more hits than the Frostwalkers. Why was that? Well, that's because the server also had a special skill system where you could level up abilities that make you tankier, deal more damage, move faster, and much more. Here's another example of a fight where a player had leveled up their auto scaffold agility feature and used it to almost escape this brawl. Pretty cool. Anyways, realizing the need to invest in leveling up their skills, the FFFFF faction contracted the help of one of the planeswalkers who had killed them and decided to spend time grinding their natural armor skill to become more tanky so they wouldn't make the same mistake again. This faction was very active, by the way. I left and then came back and checked on them a few hours later, and they had now created a large underground melon farm. Oh, and melons grow at faster speeds in Frostwalker territory, so it was decently profitable too. In the meantime, a planeswalker had been fighting a Windrunner faction, managing to kill them so many times that they became raidable. Basically, if you kill members of another faction enough times, your deaths until raidable counter continues to increase, and if they don't kill you back, eventually they can come to your base and break in. That's exactly what happened, and before the Windrunner knew what was happening, his base was being eviscerated in front of his eyes. On the other side of the map, another Windrunner was about to become the victim of a raid, as a planeswalker deep in Windrunner territory discovered the bean wall and rapidly lay waste to it. The Frostwalkers weren't the only ones who were grinding skills as well, by the way, as a Windrunner named Max TV was grinding withers, but for a bit of a different reason. You see, every so often, bosses would spawn on the server at the boss arena near spawn. Bosses could spawn in a variety of different difficulties, ranging from easy to nightmare. Max TV really wanted to solo one of the custom wither bosses and potentially get a special legendary rarity custom sword, as you'll later see, so was using normal vanilla Minecraft withers to practice and grind skills. We'll check back in tomorrow to see if he would become strong enough to solo the boss. So day 2 was a bit all over the place. Some players dedicated time to building bases and setting up farms to make money, whilst others decided they wanted to PvP and raid while they still had an early advantage. However, from here on, the days would not be nearly as peaceful, especially since day 3 was going to feature a big civilization-wide event. The underground base strategy seemed to be the go-to. Here a planeswalker stumbles across a hidden Windrunner's base without realizing that the true base was much further below his feet. That didn't stop people from settling down right at the top of large volcanic mountains though. In the meantime, a Frostwalker faction named the Frost Union had begun working on a rather large underground base spanning through multiple caves, right under some snowy mountains. We will return to them very soon. One player also decided in the midst of everything to establish the server's first religion and began the construction of a church hidden amongst the foundation of a woodland mansion. And speaking of hidden bases, check out this Windrunner faction who built their base in a tropical mountain, masking the entrance with some bamboo. This base even came equipped with Enderpearl stasis chambers for its members. This meant that if ever in a tough fight or sticky situation, one of their members could right-click the trapdoor and instantly teleport them to safety. Pretty cool. Potentially final update on the bean wallers, and it's not looking good as their bean wall is still completely obliterated. Now that players had sufficiently geared up, many of them had decided it was time to take on the bosses. As mentioned, the bosses spawned sporadically at certain degrees of difficulties. At nightmare difficulty, which was extremely challenging, there was a chance that a super powerful custom sword would drop to the player who killed the boss. But nightmare difficulty required a lot of players, a lot of communication, and also a lot of skill. So many players instead began practicing killing lower difficulty bosses first so they could learn their attack patterns, such as this group here, who decided to all work together despite being in different civilizations. And remember Max TV? Well, on day 3 he would become the very first person to slay the Wither boss, but unfortunately because he completed it solo, he was only able to fight it on medium difficulty and was not able to get the legendary sword. Still an impressive feat that rewarded him handsomely regardless. But there were even bigger things about to happen on the server, as the first civilization-wide event was about to begin. With each civilization now containing over 300 members, a King of the Hill event was going to start. Outside the spawn lay the ruins of a small castle. Within that small castle was a platform. The civilization which fought off all the others and captured the castle by standing on this platform uncontested would score a point for their civilization, but more importantly would gain a permanent economy boost with a 50% discount on prices in the in-game shop. Gaining control of the economy like this would provide the winning civilization a notable advantage over the other two, as they could buy more TNT for raiding, buy more combat items like golden apples and potions, and even buy more rare and powerful items like the super expensive creeper eggs that could be used to blow up base cores. It was an important event, that's for sure. The Windrunners got some early ground surprisingly, with the Cannibals faction leading the charge, as the Planeswalkers and Frostwalkers ran in to try to brute force the control platform without any coordination, leading them getting gradually picked off one by one. Despite the Planeswalkers and Frostwalkers eventually taking the high ground and attempting to take out the Windrunners from afar, they could just not penetrate their defenses and set foot on the control platform. The Windrunners really demonstrated a surprisingly strong performance here. I thought for sure that the Frostwalkers would come out on top, but the Windrunners simply dominated the entire event. Not once did they leave the platform uncontested. It was a huge upset. The Windrunners would confidently win the event, gaining a nice economy boost and a point for their civilization. Looking at some of the footage from one of the victorious Windrunners, a key reason it seems they won was due to better gear. Here, this player is using an epic rarity sword that provides regeneration whilst you are holding it. While it didn't have the same explosive damage as a maxed sharpness 5 sword, it did provide him with a degree of tankiness that made the long drawn out King of the Hill fight work much to his favour. Anywho, after the King of the Hill, there was a bit of drama between the Frostwalkers who were disappointed with the results. Here we have the Frostwalker faction we talked about earlier, FFFFF, getting into some conflict with another Frostwalker faction who is now trying to raid them. I should also mention, on the server, obsidian can be broken by 3 TNT shots, and the reason players can't just dig into each other's bases is because other factions can claim their land, meaning only their members can place and destroy blocks in their territory. It seems the 2 Frostwalker factions worked it out though, as minimal damage was done. Until mere minutes later, when a joint tag team consisting of a Planeswalker and Windrunner in alliance somehow managed to sneak into the FFFFF base during all the commotion. I genuinely don't know how they got in, maybe they enderpearl glitched, but what I do know is that they gradually snuck through the base's farms until they came up to one of the FFFFF members who stood guarding their core. Due to the damage from the earlier disagreement with the other Frostwalker faction, there was a hole in the obsidian which the intruders were able to enderpearl through. A fierce 2v1 then took place, which the sole FFFFF member, realizing he could not win, gave the intruders a taste of their own medicine and enderpearl glitched into the ceiling, chugging golden apples so it wouldn't die of suffocation, then teleporting out when its combat tag expired. But now, the sneaky duo had direct access to the core and could score a point for their civilization. Or could they? You see, in order to destroy a core you need TNT or creeper eggs, and since they didn't blast through the base with a cannon, they needed to go out of the base and make a cannon and blast back in, of which they successfully did, scoring the Planeswalkers the very first point for their civilization and successfully breaking the first core on the server. Despite all the drama, the FFFFF faction had already established a second base elsewhere, of which contained their rare monster spawners that they could use to earn money instead of their melon farm. They were already beginning to work their way back up after losing their melon farm base. By the end of day 2, new Windrunner bases, of which had been ignoring the fighting entirely, had become established, some of which using lava and water to make walls, which they could afford due to their newfound economy boost. They were looking to be in a good position. Day 4 finally saw the larger collaboration of these civilizations, as they all decided to collectively subscribe to the Mr. Epic. This video took forever to make, so please help me get to 700k subs by the end of the year and hit that subscribe button. No pressure. Anyways, first of all, the Frost Union faction decided to expand and create a Discord server, also called Frost Union, of which they would use to organize and communicate with other Frostwalker factions. The Frost Union had now become a collection of independent but also cooperative Frostwalker factions, all working together in unison. They also had a larger base now which multiple Frostwalker factions would have access to, a shared civilization center of operations. The newly formed Frost Union would get off to a rather explosive start, as not long after establishing, they were contacted by Windrunner Max TV, who happened to gain the trust of another Windrunner faction from the day prior, the Cannibals. You can see he was even inside the base not too long ago. The Cannibals had been quietly grinding whilst the rest of the server were fighting, and after putting up a strong showing in the King of the Hill event yesterday, they were clearly already one of the strongest factions on the server. With the help of Max TV's insider information and the Frost Union's collective wealth and firepower, the Frost Union all decided to raid the Cannibals' base. Because of Max's prior access to the base, he was able to provide the Frost Union with the direct location of the base's core, meaning they could align their TNT cannon perfectly. And after 30 minutes of cannoning, they had successfully blown up the Cannibals' core.
Which faction has claimed to destroy the core? Who's doing it?
I'll do it.
Okay, but at least pay me. Oh yeah, it's dead.
I'll pay you once I have
It's
more
It's
money.
gone?
It's gone.
I'll pay you after I have more money.
The Frostwalkers got the credit, scoring their civilization their first point and promising to pay Max handsomely for his help. But they may have celebrated too early, as one of the Cannibals' members would log on and, realizing his base was already doomed now that the core was broken, instead decided to destroy all of his valuables, preventing the Frost Union from reaping any rewards from their raid. He was prepared to go down with his ship and spawned a bunch of withers to trash his base whilst the Frost Union desperately tried to loot the valuables. They would eventually get into the cannibal stash and a fight would ensue. As it turned out though, despite the 5v1, the cannibal's member had really been grinding his skills and was super tanky.
His armor will break. His armor will break.
How long will that take though?
I need to repair mine.
Not long.
Yeah,
He's drinking.
strength bot. Just put him out. Make his armor break. Ain't no way he can do anything. He has thorns. I'm fucking so pissed.
His armor's gonna break quicker if he has thorns.
He's just surviving so much.
Guys, I can't take him on by myself. Jesus Christ.
I'm dying, I'm dying,
Don't
I'm
hit
dying,
me.
I'm dying, I'm dying.
I'm
Same
dying.
here.
Holy shit, I'm actually dying. Okay, I'm teleport up. I spam first and I teleport up. Nah.
He would eventually die, although not after taking multiple Frost Union members down with him, logging on the next day and the base was in complete ruins. The Frostwalkers, with their newfound civilization organization and power under the Frost Union, led primarily by a faction called Cookie Click, really began to grow in strength. They began doing practice fights with other Frostwalker factions where they would strategize and improve their skills, as well as prepare for future fights with other civilizations. It seemed they had the most momentum at this point. Meanwhile, the Planeswalkers were building extremely camouflaged bases in the Windrunner's trees. Okay, in all seriousness though, the Planeswalkers were struggling to work together. There were about 3 main Planeswalker factions, all of which had tried to establish a union of sorts like the Frostwalkers, but had failed because each of their leaders had too strong egos to work under the other. Basically, they all wanted to be the one in charge, calling the shots. And since none of them could agree on who deserved those positions, they all just built their own bases and refused to cooperate, instead trying to recruit any straggling Planeswalkers they came across. One of those factions happened to be known as the Dragons, a faction which had spent the past 4 days enemying every single other faction on the server, including other Planeswalker factions. Here's another called Zephyr, who also had some Windrunner members in a well-guarded base at the world border. One more here called Rome, who also had a very concealed base protecting their core with a mob grinder. These factions were all strong by themselves, and if they came together, could easily oppose the Frost Union, but due to sheer arrogance were unable to cooperate. Now, some of the other factions on the server, mostly comprised of Windrunner members, began to get worried at the power the Frost Union was accumulating. As such, they decided to officially create the United Nations Alliance and made a Discord server where a variety of factions from the Windrunner and Planeswalker civilizations could work together. It was the first attempt at a proper cross-civilization alliance designed solely to oppose the Frost Union. The United Nations would see the collaboration between about a dozen or so factions and began to schedule some meetings to discuss their plans. Here's how their first meeting went.
Thank you very much. It's very appreciated. We'll be rewarded.
They were still ironing out some kinks to say the least. In the meantime, the cannibals, after succumbing to their recent raid and betrayal, had already established a bigger and better base featuring better anti-TNT cannon technology. These guys were very dedicated. And they weren't the only dedicated players who were ignoring most of the drama of the other civilizations. Here's a faction called Nebulous, a partnership between Planeswalkers and Windrunners, also part of the United Nations Alliance, who had built a very impressive base, featuring lots of anti-TNT cannon regeneration walls situated right at the world border. Also, for some reason, some Frostwalkers, including the FFFFF faction members, decided they wanted to dig a very deep hole. We will check back in on them a bit later, but mind you, the custom world we were using featured a much greater world height and depth, so this would be a seriously challenging task as they were beginning this hole 250 blocks above bedrock, almost the same build height as an entire old Minecraft world. Towards the end of day 4, a lone Windrunner lost in a cave happened to spot the name tag of a Frostwalker in his base through a wall. After calling in an ally, what proceeded to happen next was a 15-minute standoff, followed by the Windrunner named Olas Banan accidentally blowing up his own TNT cannon, not once, but twice, before getting scared and teleporting away.
We're getting raided!
Day 5 was already off to a blast as one Planeswalker member decided to revolt against the Frostwalkers, managing to kill a smaller and weaker faction part of the Frost Union enough times that they were dominated by him, meaning he could break blocks in their territory and destroy them. This would send a strong message to the rest of the Frost Union, who were growing increasingly cocky that they weren't untouchable just yet. The United Nations Alliance would schedule and run another meeting with things going more smoothly this time.
We've gathered here today to sort out the problem about the enemies we have, right? This entire thing is about being able to work together efficiently.
Are you talking about the Kozuroki guy?
Yeah.
Kozuroki
yeah,
and the Max.
main ones that we need to kill.
Actually, we are
Need
the
to
biggest
absolute-
alliance in the server right now.
We are.
Actually, we
and
are
we
the
need
biggest
to
alliance,
use that
yeah.
to our advantage and not let it slip. We don't start the attack, we retaliate.
The simple goal is everyone needs to be making a base, obby bases, protected, covered in water. And the second thing is we all need to be grinding bosses.
Long live the United Factions, boys.
Strength in numbers was the key takeaway as the cross-civilization alliance between Windrunners and Planeswalkers discussed how they would need to begin making some serious money and get some well-protected obsidian bases established. Here they already had created an automated sugarcane farm, sugarcane being a crop which grew faster in Windrunner territory. Oh, and after extending an invite to the dragons to join the alliance, who rather impolitely turned them down, the dragons were instantly declared an enemy of the United Nations alliance and the server as a whole. So while some planeswalkers had come together with the Windrunners to form the United Nations, unfortunately still, many of the strongest planeswalkers refused to cooperate. The planeswalkers were all solid, skilled players who had begun to get rather wealthy from their hidden bases and farms, but the strongest of their factions simply refused to work together. They even began having public arguments in the Planeswalker Discord channel. None of them could get along. This would culminate in Zephyr, of which was growing to be a very strong and wealthy Planeswalker faction, getting the Frost Union's attention. Realizing that if Zephyr put aside their egos and joined the United Nations alliance, the Frost Union would be in serious trouble. So the Frost Union built one of the coolest TNT cannons I've ever seen and began launching shots at Zephyr's base. Soon enough, they had broken through Zephyr's outer layers, but the base was big and they accidentally blew up their complex cannon in the process, which meant that some parts of the base were inaccessible to them. They still managed to pillage a lot of goods and then locate the base's core. With their TNT cannon in ruins, they had to see if they could use creeper eggs to break the core. Reminder, creeper eggs are like portable TNT on the server. They are very powerful but are very expensive, meaning you really don't want to have to use a lot of them. Fortunately, after about 30 minutes of carefully controlled, expensive creeper egg explosions, the Frost Union was able to blow up Zephyr's core and score one more point for the Frost Walkers, putting them in the lead. Olas and his friend, after failing their last raid by blowing up their own cannon, stumbled across a sky base, but once again, not knowing how to TNT cannon properly, just walked around the base before giving up and teleporting away. Remember Max TV, the Windrunner who sold out the other Windrunner faction cannibals to the Frost Union, resulting in them being raided? Well, he had managed to find the cannibals' new base and glitched through a wall with an enderpearl, but couldn't get any further before being stopped. This base was much more formidable, and even being the devious traitor he was himself, he wasn't sure if he could raid it with the skills he had alone. In the meantime, Day 5 was looking to get even rougher for the Planeswalkers. A group of newer Planeswalkers at an upcoming base, maybe finally a Planeswalker faction, who would be willing to cooperate and work together with the other civilizations, was discovered by a Windrunner from the War Guild faction. And to put it politely, this Windrunner massacred them so badly, he would end up dominating their faction. From there, he waltzed into their land claims and proceeded to break and destroy everything, whilst repeatedly killing the now entirely defenseless Planeswalkers. Calling in the rest of his faction, they repeatedly spawn-killed the naked Planeswalkers over and over, an utter travesty. Using the F3+A trick, the War Guild faction would find the base's core and destroy it. You can't see the crystal because this guy has a mod enabled that disables viewing it for crystal PvP or something, but you can see its health go down and eventually fall here, granting Windrunners another point. The Frost Union's strongest faction, now named Besties or Sleepless, they kept changing their name for some reason, had also been working on a more advanced base, realizing that other players in the United Nations alliance were now working together to take them down. This base design protecting their core meant that TNT took significantly longer to blast through, as the water sources would combine with the lava sources to form more obsidian, when the blocks holding it together were blown up. Remember the Bean Wallers? Well, traumatized by the griefs from the past, they had now become the underground wheat farm towerers. Some players also figured out that blazes were a great source of XP as well as money, and had begun farming blazes in their bases to gear up for the upcoming Civilization Nightmare boss fight, whilst others were instead busy making music with note blocks. Day 6 had begun. Each of these civilizations now had almost 400 members each, and tensions were running high. I showed you this Planeswalker base earlier, but what I didn't show you was the fact that its owner had acquired quite the number of blaze spawners and had been quietly grinding in a safely defended base with multiple walls. Well, two Windrunners, including the infamous Max TV, decided they wanted those expensive spawners, but a problem lay in front of them. They didn't know how to build a TNT cannon advanced enough to get through the base's defensive walls. So they tried something experimental and a bit risky. risky. Rather than use TNT cannons to conduct a concise and controlled raid, they would risk losing the valuable loot inside the base and instead use a wither to blast their way through. Using themselves as bait, they managed to get the wither to blast a hole in the corner of the base, granting them passage in, but then accidentally blew up a good chunk of the blaze spawners and had to quickly attempt to subdue the wither before any more of the base's loot was lost. Luckily, they took down the wither without too much issue and proceeded to pillage the base for its remaining valuables. But the thing is, the wither couldn't break the base's core. It had however opened a rather large gaping hole, exposing the core by pure accident. So the raiders went out of the base again and began trying to make a TNT cannon to break the core. They had no idea how to do so though, and this was very painful for me to watch, so I may or may not have shown them how to make a very basic TNT cannon, but that was it. They had to figure out the rest themselves. A few cannon rearrangements and a bit of trial and error later, and they had begun dealing damage to the core. Another couple of shots and the Windrunner civilization had scored yet another point, putting them back in the lead. In the meantime, one of the United Nations Alliance's members had managed to stumble across the Frost Union central base of operations. The base was mostly unmanned. It seemed the Frost Union were too busy building a new base in the trees of a frozen redwood forest. Using a special gem sword he had obtained from killing one of the lower difficulty bosses, of which he got strong enough to take on because of his faction's double blaze grinder, he repeatedly killed the rather overconfident Frost Union member. Reinforcements were eventually called in, and after a long 7-minute fight that persisted through a variety of caves, the Windrunner forced his opponent to retreat, trash-talking him along the way. However, maybe that was part of the plan, as a minute later, more reinforcements arrived, and the Windrunner, realizing he was now outnumbered, ran and teleported away. Oh, by the way, remember those guys who were building a huge hole? Well, they completed it, and as it turns out, the reason they made it was because they wanted to use Bedrock breaking exploits to make a full chunk void trap. We'll see if anybody actually falls for it or not, but you have to admire the effort here. The Dragons, the Planeswalker faction who refused to cooperate and animate everyone else on the server, were about to be on the receiving end of a rather rude awakening by none other than Windrunner faction War Guild, who, tired of making music, decided to cause some chaos. They rather inefficiently but gradually TNT cannoned until they reached the outer layer of the Dragon's base, but unfortunately they didn't know how to build a hybrid cannon to pierce the water. Seems like nobody knows how to use a YouTube tutorial these days. They would eventually get in though and destroy the core, and as you can see, the next day the base was in ruins. One more point to the Windrunners. In the meantime, good old Max, the Windrunner who turned his back on his civilization to collaborate with the Frostwalker's strongest factions, part of the Frost Union, had just found and helped raid yet another Windrunner's base, meaning the Sleepless faction had just scored another point for the Frostwalkers. And that wouldn't be all the Frostwalkers would get up to on day 6 either, as here one Frostwalker, once again part of the notorious Frost Union, completely TNT cannoned an entire poor Windrunner's base, leaving only the exposed core remaining, which he easily destroyed. Yet another point for the Frostwalkers. They were on fire today, and had now drawn level with the Windrunners, but day 7 was about to be the most dangerous day yet. By day 7, the players had well and truly begun to figure out the nuances of the game mode. I logged on to find a group of 7 players desperately trying to fight off a nightmare boss using an exploit that allowed them to get out of the boundaries of the boss arena. That wouldn't be the only boss they would have to worry about today either, as each civilization, now with almost 500 members, were about to participate in a dangerous world event. But first, the uncooperative Dragons, in a fit of rage due to recently being raided by Windrunner faction War Guild, who were part of the United Nations Alliance, decided to get revenge by raiding the entirely uninvolved strongest faction in the Frost Union, Sleepless. What a mouthful. The Dragons were trying to get revenge on the complete wrong faction. That's all you need to take away from that. Extremely upset at their base's undoing only a day prior, instead of trying to help their struggling civilization and score a point by using a TNT cannon to break in and destroy the base's core, the Dragons just decided to try to destroy the base through wither raiding. Unfortunately for the Dragons, who forgot that wither raiding was a last-ditch attempt that couldn't be controlled like TNT cannoning, they took too long to get into the base, and the Sleepless faction, who for some reason decided to call a temporary alliance with some Windrunner faction, would proceed to fight them and hugely outnumber them, forcing a retreat. The Dragons once again failed due to their own selfish behavior. There were other more important events about to take place though, as the server's first nightmare difficulty with a boss was about to spawn. The player who would land the final blow on this boss would be granted a one-of-a-kind sword and would score a point for their civilization. About 100 people, all from different civilizations, got their best possible gear and prepared for the fight as the terrifying Dark Souls-esque boss spawned in. But for many, their best possible gear wouldn't be nearly enough, and upon the custom Wither boss's first attack, many underestimating his sheer power, were instantly one-shot. Some players who were in better gear also underestimated the boss and got complacent, surrounded by others, not acting quick enough to dodge the boss's surprisingly fast ranged attacks. Many players fell to the attacks of the Wither boss, and within 1 or 2 minutes, the once rather large army that had gathered to take on the boss seemed to be looking more and more like a small crowd. Only the strongest players had survived to this point, and in doing so, learned to keep their distance from the boss and to keep moving, as if they stood still for even a second, their life could be ended by the blast of one extremely deadly skull. With the boss severely weakened, some players began to get greedy and went into melee range to try to land the killing blow and claim the sword for themselves. Those players were swiftly reminded of their place though, and then the boss fell. Or did it? The Wither boss's second, weakened form would awaken, claiming the lives of another half-dozen players, before eventually being slain by a windrunner named Skeleton 8777. Skeleton 8777 would be granted the legendary one-of-a-kind demon sword, the most powerful weapon in the entire game, one of which could not be obtained in any other way. This sword had the potential to change the tides of the event. It was the most valuable weapon there was. He also had scored another point for his civilization, the Windrunners. After the boss fell, the Frostwalkers, mainly the Sleepless faction, realizing that their civilization was falling behind in power after losing both civilization-wide events, decided to get revenge on the dragons who had failed to raid them earlier that day. Giving the dragons a few hours to rebuild their base after being raided by Warguild the day prior, the Sleepless faction and the Frost Union, as well as infamous Windrunner traitor Max TV, would launch their own Wither assault, bursting into the dragon's base, looting it for all its goods, leaving nothing remaining.
We barely gave them any chance to restart.
That's for every son of a bitch who tries to raid us with 59 withers.
They would completely expose the dragon's base core using withers, and then later would cannon and destroy the core, scoring one more important point for the Frostwalkers and leveling the score once again. But where were the dragons whilst this whole situation was ongoing? Why weren't they defending their base? Well, as it turns out, whilst they were being raided, the dragon's leader was trying to wither raid the cannibal's base. Some other members of the Frost Union found him and began fighting him, intentionally keeping him in combat so he couldn't teleport back to his base to defend it. Some excellent cooperation from the Frostwalkers here, that was for certain. Day 8, the second to last day, would begin with each civilization now containing over 600 members each. Since this was now day 8 and players had spent a fair amount of time on the server, there was a bit of exploitation going on. I randomly teleported to this player who had over 10 geode cleavers, a special rare sword that could only be obtained from bosses, lying on the floor. As it turned out, I'd caught him red-handed duping. There was an exploit where if you gave a mob which could pick up items, a weapon or piece of armor, and then killed it, occasionally for some reason, they would drop 2 of those items. A niche but powerful dupe, that was for certain. Also, while the past week had contained lots of fighting, raiding, pillaging and drama, not all players were hell-bent on that lifestyle. Others opted for a simple, faithful life where they instead devoted themselves to a higher being rather than the endless pursuit of power. A Windrunner had founded a faction named Dogsteve, who by name worshipped a mythical player on the server of which had accumulated a cult following due to his various escapades named Dogsteve. Today was Sunday, and as such, church was in service. Players gathered to sit down and recite the 7 Dogsteve commandments. Thou shalt not speak blasphemous of holy Godsteve. Thou shalt pray to Dogsteve daily. Thou shalt come to the Dogsteve church every day. Thou shalt spread the word of Dogsteve throughout the world. Thou shalt undertake the holy quest of seeking the server's IP. Thou shalt use code Dogsteve to get 70% off purchases on shop.og-network.net. Thou shalt contact Alpha Doge for more information. Amen. But as the holy command of Dogsteve echoed throughout the church, terrorist naysayers loomed close. God himself spoke to me. Dogsteve granted me a sharpness 255 sword and teleported the terrorist right in front of me, where he was slain. The Church of Dogsteve has some unique practices, and after prayers are said, a ceremonial sacrifice must take place. Members of the Dogsteve Church willingly offered themselves to Dogsteve and were sacrificed in his holy glory. One by one, the ever-faithful followers of Dogstevism offered their loyal vessels, all in his name. However, the terrorists returned and attacked the Dogsteve Church, slaying all in sight, complete and utter disaster, a catastrophe of the highest order. But in an act of divine intervention, God himself heard the cries of his followers and appeared before us, in all of his holy might. Divine retribution was in order, but before the will of Dogsteve could be carried out, he was slain. Or was he? Heretic fool, you cannot slay God. God will infinitely reincarnate. The terrorist, bewildered by the power of Dog Steve, then fled the church, never to be seen again. Back to the Frost Union though, and their most powerful faction, Sleepless. Guess what they had just done? They decided to join the United Nations, of which, remember, originally was set up due to the Frost Union's scary growth in power. But only a day after joining, they went and raided one of the United Nations' main joint bases, where they held some of their meetings in, as they stated, the biggest betrayal on the server.
This is one of the biggest betrayals though, on the server.
Sure.
Oh, for sure.
Because they had joined the Alliance and as such had allied their factions, they could place blocks in the United Nations land, meaning they placed an ungodly amount of TNT and nuked the base entirely, although not before pillaging it for any of the goods it might have, and then breaking all of their chests, so whatever left would either despawn or be blown up. The base was pretty much completely destroyed, but at least the core was intact. After this, War Guild, the current strongest Windrunner faction, and also the strongest faction in the United Nations, got fed up with the Sleepless faction and the Frost Union, and therefore decided to TNT cannon into their base and raid it, putting the cocky Sleepless in their place. Would they manage to find and take down the core though, or would they fail? Well, one thing's for sure, and that's the fact that Sleepless's expensive stash of epic rarity gear, which they obtained from farming the hard difficulty bosses, was now property of War Guild. Despite not being able to access the core directly due to the way Sleepless protected it, or rather failed to do so, the End Crystal's hitbox was able to be damaged through this corner, and as such, War Guild would break through the core using expensive creeper eggs, which they were able to purchase a lot of due to their economy control, scoring Windrunners another point, a crucial point, as they had just successfully raided the most powerful and oppressive faction on the server and taken the lead with only 1 day remaining. Oh, by the way, you remember that Skeleton 8777 guy, the one who won the special demon sword? Yeah, well, he died with it whilst AFK'd a mob grinder, and as such it despawned. How anticlimactic. However, the final huge day was about to take place, and this one could decide it all. Day 9 was going to be the big judgment day. The Windrunners led by only a single point. It was anybody's game, except for the Planeswalkers whose failure to cooperate meant they were out of the race, but let's just ignore them for now. The final big event taking place today was none other than a classic Ender Dragon fight. PvP was enabled, and the victor would be the civilization who managed to obtain the Dragon Egg, and they would score not 1, but 2 points for their civilization. Because it was worth 2 points, it meant that both the Frostwalkers and the Windrunners had the chance to steal a victory here. Over 130 people logged on to participate at once, and because of all the people in the end, things began to lag a bit. At first, most players got out their bows and began firing arrows at the dragon, ignoring the end crystals entirely. Maybe their logic was that with all the players here, they could outdamage the dragon before the crystals could heal it. But very soon, most attention had been drawn away from the dragon as the civilizations began engaging in combat against one another, leaving the dragon for later. This drew on for a while, and a lot of people ended up dying, thinning numbers down significantly. However, whilst the barbarians continued to brawl below the dragon, a couple of smart players, some Windrunners part of War Guild specifically, began making preparations to intercept the dragon egg when it was killed. The fight drew on, but the dragon was soon overwhelmed by the sheer number of players and eventually fell. The race for the dragon egg was now on. Who would get it? What would happen? Which civilization would come out victorious? Well, we are about to see who is going to snatch the egg and claim glorious victory. All they have to do is get the egg and it's over. One final play, but wait a minute. Where the hell is the dragon egg? If we go to the replay and slow it down, we can see what happens. As it turns out, the Windrunners were onto something, and the little structure they built had in fact managed to intercept the egg upon the dragon dying. This player here, not you, was clearly planning this in advance and was preparing to snatch the egg until a planeswalker caught on. Not you was able to fight him off and now had the egg all to himself. Nobody else had any clue it was actually 100 blocks above them. This was his chance to secure 2 points for his civilization and win the event. He was seconds away from a total victory. But in a moment of confusion, he massively blundered, left clicking the egg, which teleporting it and his guaranteed chances of winning the event for his civilization away. This is painful to watch. He was so close to greatness. The egg then fell to the pandemonium below, but still nobody saw. Everybody had their heads pointed to the ground, expecting the egg to be hidden somewhere amongst the rubble, not hurtling towards them from above. 2 Windrunners, however, were fortunate enough to be standing right near where where the egg landed, catching it mere milliseconds before landing. This player, Kivak, reacted super fast, placing a block right before the dragon egg landed, which somehow destroyed it. But another Windrunner part of the War Guild faction would snatch it from him. Despite being in the same civilization, Kivak wanted all the glory and quickly turned his sword on the War Guild member, but failed as he escaped into the end portal. A total of 4 players saw the original egg, with only 2 seeing it break, and amongst the entire ordeal, everyone else stood around confused for the next 5 minutes, myself included. Players began to TNT away the end island to check if the egg was hidden until War Guild announced that they had secured the dragon egg in their base. What an insane turn of events. The Windrunners, who completely outsmarted the rest of the server, completely choked the dragon egg still, but then still managed to come out on top and score their civilization 2 points. Thus, the Windrunners emerged victorious, their collaboration in the United Nations Alliance being paramount to their success over the Frostwalkers. And that was that. But guess what? Everything you've seen in this video is available right now as a playable Civilizations SMP game mode on my Minecraft server, og-network.net. That's right, you yourself can pick a civilization, create a faction, destroy cores, and compete to win with your civilization, just as you've seen in this video, and you could potentially even make it into videos of mine in the future. A fully playable Minecraft Civilization server with custom bosses, items, skills, server-wide PvP events, and even something huge you didn't get to see in this video, an entire custom raid-style dungeon. Bedrock players can join too. This is open to everyone and the IP is right here on the screen. Join the server and then the game mode like so. I'm playing as well and I hope to see you all there. Be sure to subscribe as always. Thank you all so much for watching.